I want to talk about the situation in Ukraine, which, as we know, has become incredibly complicated. As we look at the current state of affairs, there are forces within Ukraine that seem to have some internal differences. One faction wants to remove President Zelensky from power, and it appears the United States is not in favor of him staying. However, the Europeans don't seem to agree with this stance, and they want to continue supporting him. The situation in Kiev is very difficult to comprehend, even for those of us looking from the outside. It's been worsened by Ukrainians themselves, who, in my opinion, suffer from an exaggerated sense of self-importance. It's been made even more complicated by corruption investigations, which, as it turns out, are largely being fueled by the U.S. side. These investigations have been ongoing for a while now, particularly focusing on the USID financing, as well as the George Soros-backed NABU and SAPO investigative units. These efforts are trying to isolate Zelensky from his associates, and right now, the focus is on Timur Mindik. But when we step back and look at the bigger picture, it's clear that none of those involved in the corruption allegations, nor those trying to replace the corrupt, actually want the war to end. It's also important to note that neither Zelensky nor his principal advisor, Yermak, show any willingness to negotiate or agree to terms that could bring the war to a close. This isn't part of a plan to end the war. It's simply an effort to change the faces around the table without changing the course of the conflict. When it comes to new agreements between Zelensky's administration and France, as well as Germany's discussions about the ongoing conflict, it's clear that Europe wants to keep the war going, but without engaging directly in military confrontation with Russia. It seems the main objective is to continue supporting Ukraine financially and militarily without the risk of a direct military loss. The truth is, the European defense industry is booming because of this war. Countries like Germany, France, and the UK are heavily invested in maintaining the conflict, benefiting from the increased defense spending. This has resulted in significant share price increases for European and US defense stocks, which have tripled in value since the war began in 2022. The war is good for shareholders, and it's good for politicians too, because it generates votes, bonuses, and union support. But the reality is that this is all part of a much larger financial system designed to continue the war without directly engaging in it. The Ukrainian people are the ones paying the price as they face severe losses on the battlefield and struggle with power shortages as winter sets in. When it comes to the sanctions against Russia, it's clear that both Marco Rubio and Donald Trump have admitted that they're running out of options. Rubio has openly stated that the sanctions against Russia are not working as intended, and Trump, while continuing to talk tough about sanctions, has made it clear that he doesn't believe they will have a significant impact. In addition, Trump has shown willingness to talk to countries like Venezuela and China despite sanctions, showing that his strategy of using force to achieve peace is failing across the board. He's retreating from this strategy because it's not working. As we look at the broader geopolitical landscape, it's clear that Pakistan is playing a significant role in shaping the future of U.S. foreign policy. With its complex relationship with India and China, and its involvement in the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, Pakistan is becoming a crucial strategic partner for the U.S. However, the U.S. needs to reassess its approach, particularly in light of India's growing influence in the defense threats posed by Pakistan. In the end, the world is watching as the Trump administration retreats from its aggressive stance. The conflict in Ukraine, the tensions in the Middle East, and the looming threat of sanctions are all contributing to a shifting global order. It's becoming more apparent that the U.S.'s current approach to diplomacy and military strategy is failing, and change is inevitable. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Let's get into the Ukraine Energy Gate scandal. This is something I think is important, and we haven't covered Ukraine in a while. Is greater than. So basically, in Ukraine, Zelensky is facing his biggest corruption scandal to date. His allies at the state-owned nuclear energy company, close allies, someone who basically helped bankroll his whole operation, is accused of operating a kickback scheme for in the energy sector worth more than $100 million in kickbacks. And this comes at a time when Ukrainians, because of increased Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, are having to go more and more without heat and power. And so this is, and right as you know, we're entering into winter. Funny enough, this was uncovered by this Ukrainian anti-corruption agency that's heavily backed by the West, and that Zelensky tried to shut down this past summer. And when he tried to do that, it also led to the biggest protests that he's faced since taking power. Now, these agencies, which are heavily backed by the West, so then you have to wonder, is there a Western hand in this coming out? Is there a move being made against Zelensky by some of his supposed allies in the West? I don't know. But this is all coming out now, and it's a major crisis for him, especially as Ukrainians are going without power, and especially as just this growing crisis of desertions and people not wanting to be sent off to die to fight this war that is now almost 4 years old. The anniversary of the Russian invasion is coming up in February. So the regulatory agencies, which were installed by the West, heavily funded by the EU, as part of the bargain for dumping so much money into one of the most corrupt countries, I think the most corrupt country in Europe. This was sort of the bargain. Oh, we'll give you all this if you let us have these regulatory agencies. Then Zelensky moves to shut them down. Nabu and Sapo, right? That was last summer. Is greater than. The friction begins. You start to see these kind of color revolution style protests in the streets of Kyiv with the technocratic youth who work for the Nazis, the kind of people who came out in the Maidan in 2014, and now they're protesting against Zelensky. They went away. You know, it's war. They're on a war footing. Zelensky can always kind of keep people circling the wagons. Now things are getting really bad. And the figure who, I mean, what is the scandal? The energy companies were getting kickbacks of 15% is greater than in order to sign contracts. And the person presiding over that corruption scheme was known as Zelensky's wallet. What's his name? His name is Timur Mushik. Yeah, Mushik. Okay. So Timur Mushik was also the accountant for Igor Komoisky, as far as I understand, and he helped set up Zelensky's show, Servant of the People, and a lot of other Zelensky-related entertainment ventures, which made Zelensky a household name. Komoisky was kicking in the money, and Mishik was overseeing all of these various companies. So Mishik has this long connection to Zelensky, and now he has fled, and he is now in Israel. Yes. I'll just say, of all places, he fled to Israel, which is just funny, and also is greater than where all the like old corrupt oligarchs from Ukraine and Russia go, like Berezovsky, for example. Is greater than, yeah. Is greater than, because they have a non-extradition policy. The irony is that, you know, it should be Israelis fleeing back to Ukraine and to Russia because that's actually where they come from. But anyway, that's another story. But yeah, so he fled to Israel. And this is actually a real crisis for Zelensky. And if you're in the West, but he does still, it looks like, have the backing of Europe, of his key European allies, is greater than, and the U.S. is greater than, and the U.S. who are, you know, especially the Europeans who are desperate to keep this show going, this proxy war going. So, for example, Jens Stoltenberg, he's the former head of NATO, and he said that this corruption scandal is basically, it's all the more reason to keep funding the Ukraine proxy war. I know also that President Zelensky really works hard to fight corruption, and we should support him in those efforts. But the right response is not to reduce support to Ukraine. The right response is to continue to provide substantial economic and military support to Ukraine and then help them in fighting corruption, because it's urgent and it's important for us that Ukraine succeeds in stopping the Russian aggression. So because they're corrupt, it's urgent, we give them more. That makes sense. Yeah. But the problem they're facing now is, where's the money going to come from? Because the US, at least for now, has stopped providing the funding. Trump does not want to go back to Congress and ask for more money. I mean, like, you never know with him. That could be yet another betrayal that he does of his campaign promises. But I think for him, that would be even a stretch, after he kept talking about how we're not going to give Ukraine any more money and we're going to end the war. So where do they find the money from? Well, now their only recourse is to basically steal Russian assets, because there were a lot of Russian assets that were frozen after Russia invaded. But if you do that, then you're basically blowing up the entire credit system of the EU. You're basically saying that, like, you cannot rely on the EU banking system. So internally, there's a lot of division over that. But for proxy warriors who are committed to continuing this war, that's really their only option at this point, because their societies are facing internal decay. Living standards have plummeted. Energy prices are higher. So, like, where's the money going to come from? Welfare has already been cut in some states. And so there's not enough money there to cut. So what do? I mean, their only recourse now is to steal Russian money. And here is the same attitude of basically just complete indifference to Ukrainian lives. It's very much pervasive. This is Kayakawa, the top EU diplomat. This is what she said today. Supporting Ukraine is a bargain compared to the cost of Russia's victory. Wars are lost by whoever runs out of money or soldiers first. Supporting Ukraine, I mean, how does that even stand to reason? Like, Europe has suffered so much economic damage from this war, is greater than, yeah. And she says, like, wars are won by whoever runs out of money and soldiers first. Well, who is losing more soldiers? It's obviously Ukraine, just based on their sheer size compared to Russia. Russia hasn't had to kidnap people off the streets the way Ukraine has. You can see it in all the videos that come out of Ukraine, because Ukraine just has far fewer people. Russia is just such a massively bigger country, which speaks to why, one of the many reasons why it was such folly to have this whole proxy war to begin with. But the attitude remains, let's just keep sending more Ukrainians off to die and keep coming up with money to keep this thing going. And that seems to be the dominant attitude. And the problem is, even though the Trump administration, people like Trump and J.D. Vance, who are not ideologically committed to, a proxy war in this way, they're still not willing to do what it takes to reach a peace deal with Russia, to actually address Russian grievances that go beyond Ukraine, expansion of NATO, arms control, the so-called missile defense sites that the U.S. has in Poland and Romania. Trump's not going to roll that back. That's not in his wheelhouse to engage in diplomacy like that. The last president willing to do that, you can argue, was Reagan. Like, Reagan was the last president seriously interested in diplomacy with Moscow when they, reached things like the INF Treaty, which Trump then killed. Obama did do New START, and that's a good thing. But aside from that, Obama also did the Maidan coup, also expanded or modernized, quote unquote, the U.S. nuclear arsenal. He also, after initially he said he wasn't going to go ahead with George W. Bush's so-called missile defense sites in Poland and Romania, he did. So what happens in Washington is, no matter what the intention of the president is, they come up against the permanent pro-war bureaucracy, and that's who ultimately calls the shots. And here's former BlackRock executive and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz explaining how the war is just benefiting Germany, why and how it's been such a boon for Germany. Actually, this really, if you read into his comments, strongly contradicts Kaja Kallas and also highlights the inhumanity of EU leadership. Oh, well, I have to translate. Zelensky must make sure Ukrainians serve their country instead of leaving for Germany. Jeez. Yeah. Um, he's saying Zelensky has to crack down harder on corruption and keep young Ukrainians from leaving the country. Well, they're leaving the country because they don't want to be sent to the meat grinder. So BlackRock says you have to go to the meat grinder because BlackRock increasingly owns lots of land in Ukraine and wants to buy up more of Ukraine. It wants the spoils of war. Uh, they've created an impossible situation for themselves where they have to shoulder the burden of inevitable migration while keeping the war going. These people are insane. And at the same time, it's MERS who will profit, not the average German, particularly German, less skilled laborers who are being pushed out of their jobs in competition with Ukrainians who are willing to work for less, who are working lots of like Uber type jobs in places like Poland. So this war is not economically benefiting Europe in any way. And yet they're asking to dump more money in when the country is in the grips of a massive corruption scandal that isn't being covered in the US. Uh, I mean, you have to really look for coverage of this. It just so like, where is all this going? It just means this war continues and Russia is going to take more territory. That's been the trajectory of the war. Russia's gone at a very slow pace. But they're doing that for obvious reasons. They're just trying to wait out Ukraine. They have a lot more people. They have a much more efficient military production process than the West does. So they're just going to keep waiting this out and slowly take more territory. And unless there's a change in Washington, that's just how it's going to go. A lot more Ukrainians will be sentenced to death and Russians to, I mean, I often wonder, like with Putin, like if you were to tell Putin that, like nearly 4 years later, you'd still be fighting this war and you'd have lost, hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know the exact death toll in Russia. The U.S. estimate is around 1 million. That strikes me as too high, but what do I know? But regardless, it's a lot of people that he sacrificed. Would he have done what he did back then if he knew that this would still be going? He expected this to be over a lot quicker than it was. And one of the reasons why it wasn't over so quickly is because the US and the UK sabotaged the diplomacy that Zelensky immediately undertook with Russia. But certainly Putin's not backing down now. He's invested too much in this. And so that's where we're headed. It's just like, so I guess the question is, how far is Russia going to go inside of Ukraine before they can decide that they've taken enough to be able to declare a victory? And how soon before Zelensky becomes Yahya Netanyahu's neighbor in Miami, because Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, and former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko are now talking about forming a unity government, and many Ukrainians are turning against Zelensky, who's increasingly just propped up by the West. Well, the irony there is that Klitschko was part of an agreement to have a unity government with Yanukovych back in February 2014. There was a power-sharing deal that would have kept Yanukovych in power under reduced authority, have early elections, and Klitschko agreed to that. He was one of the more sort of moderate Maidan leaders, but the hard right element of the Maidan, the ultras, the neo-Nazis, the fascists, whatever you want to call them, they sabotaged that. And they did that with U.S. backing because the U.S. immediately after blessing this power sharing deal, after the coup happened with, on the strength of the hard right, the ultranationalists, the U.S. immediately welcomed the coup and said that this was a great thing. So, it's just funny how this, and of course, what was the main impetus or what was the initial spark for the Maidan along with Yanukovych, along with him delaying signing the EU trade pact because he didn't actually outright reject it. He just delayed signing because he wanted better terms. It was corruption. People were upset about corruption. And now you have Zelensky, who took power on the strength, or at least, who took power after, was elected in an election that happened after that coup. Now he's facing massive corruption charges. And so it all underscores that all this could have been avoided had simply the ultranationalists in Ukraine and their Western backers been willing to respect agreements that had already been made. The MSA accords and then the power sharing agreement that would have left Yanukovych in power for just a little bit longer under reduced authorities